Now, the ones conspicuous by their absence at the G20 summit this year are Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Russian President Putin. China is being represented by Chinese Premier Li Jiang. No reasons given for Xi's absence, who is missing a G20 summit for the first time. Remember, there have been strained relations between India and China amid the border row at Ladakh and the recent map controversy, where the Chinese map included Arunachal Pradesh and XiJinping in Ladakh. China has also been weighed down by challenges to their economy, where key indices of which have been sliding regularly recently. And to discuss this further, I'm joined by our guest this afternoon. I'm joined by Mr. Dr. Jagannath Panda, who has been the head of Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs. I'm also been joined by Achal Malhotra, who's been a former ambassador. Well, thank you so much for both of you to joining us over here this afternoon. My first question would go across to you, Mr. Malhotra. Well, Putin and Xi Jinping both have decided to skip the G20 meeting. Now, even though the External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, maintains that their absence should not be seen as an anomaly because it's not the first time around that the head of a state skips a G20 meeting or a summit like this. But do you think this is taken in a good spirit because everybody was expecting for all the global leaders to descend here in the national capital? Or do you feel, Mr. Malhotra, that there is a design way by which they have decided to skip the G20 here in India?
Well, Saima, let me put it this way. As far as the Russian President Vladimir Putin is concerned, nobody expected him to be present for this G20 because it's not only the G20, he has been also skipping other important summit meetings. And it's quite understandable because the kind of pressure is being put on him in the backdrop of Russia-Ukraine war. But he had the gutsy to call our Prime Minister and explain and inform that he was deputing his Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who's a seasoned diplomat and a really, a very important leader in their country. But in the case of Xi, there has been absolutely no explanation. Having said that, I would also like to underline that we must understand they are not boycotting the G20. It's only that they have downgraded the level of participation and the level of representation. In the case of Xi, again, so many reasons are being cited, starting from his possible bad health, poor health of the economy in, China and some other domestic compulsions. But I think the most important thing from my point of view, how I look at it is that Xi Jinping definitely anticipated that he will not feel comfortable in the presence of the top leaders of the world who already carry an anti-China sentiment. And there are certain issues on which they don't see an eye to eye with each other. Particularly when we are talking about the problem of debt stress amongst the developing countries particularly, we are pointing directly towards China because it's China's BRI and the debt trap policy which has created a situation like that. And in any case, the core issues in the G20 are different from the geopolitical issues. It's a different matter that in this time, this Russia-Ukraine war is having its shadow over the deliberations of G20, and as a result, so far all the statements...
But Mr. Malhotra, do you think it's safe to say that China is shying away from facing the world because they do have a lot of backlog when it comes to explanations are concerned, whether it's the COVID, the management of COVID, the outbreak, how they have maintained a very opaque system by which they are not allowing any, divergence of information to the rest of the world, the cooperation that the world was seeking from China. China has really failed on all those accounts. Having said that, the recent manner in which the economy of China has also seen a gradual slump, do you think that China found it safe to avoid the global leaders rather than facing them?
Yes, I was mentioned in my previous statement. One of the reasons which appeals to me is that he anticipated that he will not be comfortable in the presence of all these global leaders who definitely have an anti-China, sentiment. Whether it has been expressed post-COVID, whether it has been expressed through the formation of Quad or Outpost, or from almost all global fora, there is something or else which is spelled out, which is pronounced, which is targeted at China. So obviously, and the Vladimir Putin, the only ally of China, important ally of the China in the context of G20, is also missing from here. So I think he thought, and also somewhere in the back of Xi's mind would be that this is an opportunity where he can be a spoiler, in a sense that the India's rising clout is not being able to digest the rising clout of India on the global arena, and the manner in which we are conducting G20, the manner in which the rest of the world is seeking, reaching out to India. But I must also add that it's his own loss also to a certain extent. Uh, we are not talking much about the fact that in the
Yes.
recent months there has been some outreach from the Americans and the Westerns towards China. There have been delegations which have been visiting China, and probably this would have been a good opportunity for him to have a talk with Joe Biden towards normalization of their relations. But probably he wants to have this dialogue at a place and a time of his choice, and not on the soil of India. That's how I look at it. And of course, it's very difficult to explain why
Sure.
on the you can say that releasing those kind of maps on the eve of the G20 is a part of mischief. It has already strengthened the anti-China sentiment amongst the Southeast Asian countries, particularly the ASEAN member countries, many of whom have got dispute with China over their aggressive claims on their territories. So it's a totality. You have to see it in the entire totality. But let me wind it up by
Well,
saying that
absolutely,
it's
Mr.
not
Malhotra,
going
like you were
to have.
mentioning, let's not leave anything to chance. Whatever China does is very calculated, whether it's inclusion of the Indian states or the XiJinping into their map. It's all to try and provoke and trigger India in that sense to see what response are they going to get. Mr. Jagannath Panda is also waiting over here. Mr. Malhotra, I'll just come back to you. Mr. Panda, a
Yeah,
few
sure.
reactions from you. You just heard what Mr. Malhotra had to say. Clearly, as far as China is concerned, they are running away from facing the world, essentially what Mr. Malhotra was saying, and they have their reasons for it. And of course, like Mr. Jaishankar, the External Affairs Minister, also maintains, it's not an anomaly. It's not the first time around that a head of a state hasn't attended a given summit. They do send their representative in their place. But this also goes on to show the India's position that only gets strengthened over here, where India is trying to get all the strive two nations together, but over here China decides to wriggle out.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I think I would agree with Ambassador Malhotra here completely. In fact, a couple of points. One is that, Xi Jinping skipping the meeting explains that he has got a personal discord with Prime Minister Modi, and most importantly, the widening gap that is rising between China and India. With this, decision by Xi Jinping not attending the G20 summit explains that China is actually allowing India to be seen as an alternative power in the Asian and in the Indo-Pacific gambit. And that's a strategic mistake by China. And second, China, as a bigger economy, cannot do such a mistake at a time when the global economy, the governance issues need the Chinese participation. We saw recently, just a couple of weeks back, that the BRICS hosted another meeting and expanded the BRICS membership. So therefore, the Chinese leadership, the global leadership formulations has been quite problematic, and that will be hugely noticed by many countries, particularly from the South Asian regions, from the Indo-Pacific regions, those which are lower and middle-ranked economies. The second fact is that I think I would agree with Ambassador Malhotra here, that I think at a time when we are talking about the global economic recovery and debt draft, and particularly talking about infrastructure building, strategic resilience, sustainable developments, the Chinese participation would have been key. So Xi Jinping's absence in the G20 summit only explains that China has only got its own nationalist mandate to the global affairs. It does not really, acknowledge, it does not really partake in a partaking and share leadership formulations. And probably this mistake of not attending G20 summit is a huge mistake by the Chinese leadership. And it will only widen the gap that Xi Jinping is building for China in the post-pandemic to post-pandemic period.
Oh, well, absolutely, Mr. Panda. But also, interestingly, how Mr. Malhotra was saying that there is certain outreach by US towards China that cannot be ignored either. But, now here, when Putin isn't showing up and when Xi Jinping isn't showing up, it almost reestablishes US to position itself as the pole star of the international system. And they can perhaps go ahead and re-establish their ties with other nations like South Africa, Brazil and Indonesia, who are yet to take position on issues pertaining to the Ukraine-Russia war. Do you think that this is also that opportunity that China has let it slip from their grasp?
I think here we need to be clear about what kind of foreign policy we are going to envision from now on. It's pretty clear that even though the strategic discord between China and India and China and the US has expanded over the last few years, and it has in a way brought India and the US together to a great extent, and the kind of chemistry are rising between India and the US on the strategic issues, particularly in the Indo-Pacific regions. But we should not do a miscalculation here. At the end of the day, strategic interest, the national interest matters a lot. And when it comes to the American foreign policy and the Chinese foreign policy, the national interest of both the countries is to put them at the helm of the global affairs. So let's not do this mistake of miscalculating US-China, calculations or miscalculations. There is a G20 formulations both US and China are engaged with, and they are pushing for a long time. And India should not be misreading such an assessment from the US-China point of view. So when it comes to the US-China relationship, we should be mindful about each and every debate,
point you make
each
over
and
there,
every
Mr. Panda.
development. But at the same time, we should be very carefully positioning ourselves in global affairs, including in the G20.
Absolutely. This is the last question to you, Mr. Malhotra, before I let go of both of you and we wrap this conversation over here. Mr. Malhotra, does this also mean essentially that China is still trying to, dig in their heels when it comes to the Indo-China border issues, the border clashes? Because since the Galwan in 2020, the relations between India and China has been strained. And it also almost to indicate that China is not willing to budge and let India take position on the Indian soil on the borders.
Yes, definitely. Despite 19 or 20 rounds of talks that we have had, it's quite apparent, it's good that these talks have been helpful in preventing any unpleasant incident on the borders or the line of actual control. But it's also quite apparent that China is not likely to budge because then domestically or even internationally, he would be seen as, taking a weaker position, like his that would expose his weakness, which he would hate to do. So perceptions matter a lot. So what they are trying to do is they want India to go back to the old, kind of system, whereby we had decided to put the border disputes at the back burner and let the our engagement in other sectors continue. And whereas we have already taken a firm position that unless there is a peace, tranquility at the borders, there can't be a conducive atmosphere for holding any meaningful discussion or dialogue on other issues. So it is a stalemate. I don't know whether our policy of no talks till the border dispute is resolved or they go back to the old positions is sustainable or not, while the rest of the world is, showing all the inclinations, even USA and the West, to engage China, even if it is selectively. So we have to have a look at it. But of course, our situation is different. None of those countries share this, such a long border with China, and the kind of threat we can anticipate is theoretically possible to us from China is totally different from the kind of challenges Americans and the Westerns visualize for themselves. For them, it's a it's a position. It's a challenge to the #1 position for America. For Southeast Asia, it's again territorial claims. For the Europe, apparently economics,
Absolutely.
climate change. But for us, it's physical. We're sitting next door to each other. A war between the two countries can put our economy back by several years. So we
Absolutely,
have
and
to.
India has made it amply clear that unless there is a peace at the border front with China, even India would not want to engage. But G20 was a summit for which it's China's loss. Like both of you, Mr. Panda and Mr. Malhotra, agree that China has missed out on being able to iron out differences with the other nations as well. And clearly, it only shows India emerging as the the bigger leader over here in the South Asian nations. Well, thank you so much for joining us over here at Mirror Now for this discussion here.
Thank you.